First, the penitential rites in the first centuries. I will not enter into the discussion which have taken place and which continue still as to the progressive development of these penitential rites in early Christianity. I would like only to underline one fundamental fact. Penance, in the first centuries of Christianity, is not an act, a determined act. Penance is a status which presents several characteristics. The function of this status is to avoid the definitive expulsion from the church of a Christian who has committed one or several serious sins. As penitent, he is excluded from many of the ceremonies and the collective rites, but he does not cease to be a Christian. And by means of this status, he can obtain his reintegration. This status is therefore a long-term affair. It affects most aspects of life: fasting obligations, rules about clothing, interdictions on sexual relations, and the individual is marked to such an extent by this status that even after his reconciliation, he will still suffer from certain number of prohibitions. For instance, he will not be able to become a priest. Now, amongst the elements of this status, the obligation to facere veritatem, as would say Augustine, the obligation to manifest the truth is fundamental. To manifest the truth, I don't speak of the enunciation of sins. I employ a much more imprecise and obscure expression, manifestation of the truth. In fact, to designate the truth gain inherent to penitence, the Greek fathers used the enigmatic word exomologesis, and Latin writers often use the Greek word exomologesis without any translation. What does mean this term? In a very general sense, this word refers to the recognition of a fact, an agreement to the truth of a fact. But in the penitential rite, and refer to penitential rites, I think that things can be represented schematically in the following manner. When a sinner seeks penance, he presents to the bishop the reasons for his demand. That is to say, he explains the faults which he has committed. This presentation, in any case, was to be extremely brief and was not a part of the penance itself. It preceded the penance, it was not a part of it. At the other end of the penitential procedure, when the moment of reintegration came, an episode took place which the text regularly called exomologesis. Some descriptions are very early and some very late, but they are almost identical. Tertullian, for instance, describes the ceremonies thus. I quote, "The penitent wears a hair shirt and ashes. He is wretchedly dressed. He is taken by the hand and led into the church. He prostrates himself before the widows and the priests. He hangs on the skirts of their garments. He kisses their knees." Much later, Jerome describes in the same way the penitence of Fabiola, who had married a second time before the death of her first husband. And I quote, "During the days which preceded Easter, Fabiola was to be found amongst the ranks of the penitents. The bishop, the priest, and the people wept with her. Her hair disheveled, her face pale, her hands dirty, her head covered in ashes. She chastened her naked breast and the face with which she had seduced her second husband. She revealed to all her wound, and Rome, in tears, contemplated the scars on her emaciated body." No doubt, Jerome and Tertullian were liable to be rather carried away by such things. However, in Ambrose and other ones, it is possible to find indication which show clearly the existence of an episode of dramatic self-revelation at the moment of the reconciliation of the penitent. But the term of exhomologesis does not apply only to this final episode. Frequently, it is used to designate everything that the penitent does to obtain his reconciliation during the time in which he retains the status of penitent. The acts by which he punishes himself must be indissociable from the acts by which he reveals himself. The punishment of oneself and the voluntary expression of oneself are strictly bound together. A correspondent of Cyprian at the end of the 3rd century writes that those who wish to do penance must, I quote, prove their suffering, show their shame, make visible their humility, and exhibit their modesty. And Pacian in the Paraneses said that the true penance is accomplished not in a nominal fashion, but finds its instruments in sackcloth, ashes, fasting, affliction, and the participation of a great number of people in prayers. In few words, penance in the first Christian centuries is a way of life acted out at all times out of an obligation to show oneself, and that is precisely exhomologesis. This form, attested to from the end of the 2nd century, will subsist for an extremely long time in Christianity, since one finds its after effects in the orders of penitents, so important in the 15th and in the 16th century. One can see that the procedure for showing forth the truth are multiple and complex in it. Certain acts of exhomologesis make place in private, but most are addressed to public. Tertullian has a characteristic expression to designate this aspect of penance, publicatio sui. The penitent must speak, use a verbal means to express himself as a sinner. But in this showing forth of oneself, the non-verbal part is the most important: clothing, gestures of supplication, tears, and so on. In this exhomologesis, and Tertullian has a very beautiful expression to translate exhomologesis, he says, publicatio sui. In this publicatio sui, the sin is referred to not through a precise description, not through a verbal analysis, but principally through somatic and symbolic expressions, showing her own body. Fabiola put under everybody's eyes the flesh which has committed the sin. But there is something paradoxical in this. The publicatio sui has, in fact, two functions. It is destined to rub out the sin, to strike it out, to make it disappear, to restitute the previous purity acquired by baptism. But it is also destined to show the sinner as he is, dirty, defiled, sullied. The greater part of the acts which constitute penance have the role not of telling the truth about the sin, it has the role of showing the true being of the sinner or the true sinful being of the subject. The Tertullian expression publicatio sui is not a way to say that the sinner has to explain his sins. The expression means that he has to produce himself as a sinner in his reality of sinner. And now the question is why the showing forth of the sinner should be efficient to efface the sins. To give a succinct glimpse into this problem, one may say that the Christian fathers have recourse to three models. The well-known medical model: one has to show his wounds if he wants to be cured. Another model is often used, the model of tribunal and of judgment. One always appears one always appeases one's judge by spontaneously confessing to one's faults. The day of judgment, the devil himself will stand up to accuse the sinner. If the sinner has already anticipated him by accusing himself, the enemy will be obliged to remain quiet. But the most important model used to justify the necessity of exhomologesis or publicatio sui in penance is of an altogether different nature. It is the model of martyr. It must not be forgotten that the practice and the theory of penance were elaborated to a great extent around the problem of the relapsed. The martyr is he who prefers to face death rather than abandon his faith. The relapsed abandons the faith in order to keep the life of here below. He will be reinstated only if, in his turn, he exposes himself voluntarily to a sort of martyrdom to which all will be witnesses, and this kind of martyrdom is penance. In brief, penance, insofar as it is a reproduction of martyrdom, is an affirmation of metanoia, of change, of rupture with oneself, with one's past, a rupture with the world, and with all the previous life.